I was just watching one of your videos about the pronunciation of the M just before you came on,
Final M, yeah.
which is yeah, really fascinating because I remember in school I was never really taught taught that, and it's great to have your content on it.
Yeah, it's interesting how the thing that I've noticed especially is the difference between convention and reality and how that's not clearly understood. Usually because of the limitations of teachers, the limitations in their own uh it's even education sounds a little strong. Perhaps erudition sounds a bit better in the sense of how much have they actually been taught. Dead
Mm,
languages frequently are not taught with an emphasis on reconstructed ancient phonology. There's just a convention, and there you go. So, for example, the way that traditionally Latin is pronounced in English-speaking countries is usually the classical pronunciation, but not really. In fact, it's so divergent from it, it makes the worst sounding Italian version of the ecclesiastical
yeah,
pronunciation, like abet, something
yeah,
that's quite absurd, also completely historically inaccurate, but yet often can be closer if you're like counting how many letters end up approaching the true theoretical values of
Mm,
a reconstructed pronunciation. So it's interesting the discrepancy between them.
yeah, yeah. It's fascinating because it's funny because I always studied Latin because I studied it at school like a lot of people, and I always had a real curiosity about sort of how it was really pronounced, but I just found that there was no real sort of curiosity out there. No one really seemed to share this sort of interest that I had. No
Well,
one seemed to
and
care, you know.
well, yeah, what's interesting that of course they do. There are they being lots and lots of people.
Yeah.
They just happen to have been people who may have been curious at some point during
Mm,
during their schooling, but simply through the osmosis of a teacher with a traditional native English accent and using a reconstructed type pronunciation, but very far from it, as is
mm,
very common in both England and the US. It ends up that becomes what Latin is, such that I've often received comments from native English speakers, for example, who say there's no way that Latin sounded that Italian
yeah.
the way I
Yeah.
do it, for example. And reason I sound Italian to these people is two reasons. One is because I might observe the vowel, not diphthongization of vowels, for example, and we can't do in most English accents. For example, an e or o, we want to make them a or o, such as I do in my American
Mm,
diphthongization of those vowels, which are different in British, of course, and different varieties. But in any case, they're normally not monophthongs, and therefore just
mm,
hearing a and o, that's a little off-putting, and then trilling an r, and so forth, that can be called like, well, that's not really that really,
yeah.
and it
Yeah. Yeah.
because that which is Latin for such folks is not is so far from the actual the theoretical reconstruction, but they don't know that, and thus
Mm,
that's one reason. The other is that I also attempt to put Italian intonation into my Latin with mixed results from those who hear it. No Italian has ever said I sound like I'm Italian, as hard as
mm.
I've tried. However, other Romance speakers, like Brazilians, for example, they say, "Oh, you sound so Italian." I'm like, "Oh, thank you. I'll accept it." Other Brazilians
Yeah.
like it, so okay.
Is the idea there that you're trying to sort of replicate the sort of way that you'd express the words in Italian?
Yeah, and nor am I saying that one must have these somewhat superficial or aesthetic characteristics. Not
mm,
superficial, super segmental. The segments being the really fundamental stuff, the more, the building blocks of syllables,
mm,
phonemic vowel length, that kind of stuff. Super segmental is more like accents, meaning the prosody of the line and so forth.
mm,
That is not easily discovered from reconstruction. We can hypothesize. Ultimately, though,
mm,
one can certainly use a very good reconstructed pronunciation of Latin, but still do things that are within the realm of the unknown and sound very English-like, very German-like, very
mm,
Russian-like. I my thus well, okay, you can. The problem that people perceive in this is the difference between subjective and objective. You feel that oh, you're doing something that's foreign, you're sounding Italian or you're sounding Spanishy or Portuguese, some Romance language thing is what I'm recommending. Like, no, you should just sound neutral. But
Mm,
neutral to such a person is more in line with what they think neutrality is, which is based on their native language. So the
mm,
neutrality
mm,
for a German sounds different from neutrality for a native English speaker, for different for a Spaniard, etc. So there is no neutral when it comes to those intonational sort of patterns, those melodic kind of things that when we learn a foreign language well, where we lose our foreign accent, or we
mm.
start to lose it, as I have continued to try to do in
Yeah,
Italian at the moment.
yeah, yeah.
But we all have an accent. Um, but should one speaking modern Spanish use a British accent in Spanish? Is
Mm,
that desirable? I mean, there's nothing wrong with it in the sense that, hey, this person's learning a foreign language. Fantastic. Why should one learn um, a near native pronunciation? And that's a question we can talk about.
mm. Yeah, well, it's funny because I do think um, there's a sort of lot of reason to learn the classical, learn how to pronounce the Latin, like take that quite seriously when you start reading poetry and stuff like that. Um,
Mm.
because I mean, kind of prose, it's kind of, I mean, we can go into that as well. You know, there's maybe it's less about the sort of rhythm of the language, but um, it's just such a shame. It's funny because when I sometimes I see people who aren't sort of interested in the sort of sounding of the Latin language, and they'll just kind of read the just a line of verse, just like sort of in an English accent, and it's like all the excitement is in the sort of the vowel lengths and the
Yeah.
lining everything properly. So I mean I do think it's really important, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are different levels. The sort of extreme version of the argument is where I recommend utilizing as much as one can the super segmental characteristics of Spanish or Italian or something, Romance languages that seem to have diverged less.
Mm,
And as different Italians and Spaniards say, they don't these languages don't sound anything like one another. In fact, if you might be familiar with the different kind of dialects or accents within Spain, within
mm,
Italy, the accents are all over the place.
yeah,
But from the perspective of a Northern European, they sound real similar. And that's the sort of that's the broader goal. It's almost like I don't know, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle or something, to throw in a different kind of science into it. Just that, like, you can't really get perfectly there, but there's a probability cloud of
mm,
where we should go, and the electron or the pronunciation is most likely here in this region rather than way over in Northern
mm,
Europe.
mm. Well, what is sort of both sort of fascinating and infuriating about getting an accurate pronunciation is there's just no right answer. You never will know for sure, you know,
Right.
and it's
Well,
just
what's the right? Look at us. We don't have the same native accent.
yeah, yeah,
Right. So what there's there's nothing wrong with that. And we also, of course, can communicate fluently. This is something also too I talk about. I used to be super like classical pronunciation. That's what you should learn.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
I realized, well, I relented, and I'm glad I did, because it opened up me to be able to listen to other voices, and then to recommend that, like, okay, yeah, I know you prefer classical pronunciation. Hey, I hear you. I was with you, but then I started reciting some stuff in ecclesiastical to the point where I'm able to usually converse in ecclesiastical pronunciation without making too many mistakes,
yeah, yeah,
with some fluency. I'm almost as fluent as I can do in classical pronunciation. And the result is that not only does it increase my own appreciation, but my understanding of it. And that's for people who are advanced as Latin speakers. There's no problem at all, just as there's no problem for most British and Americans to understand each other,
mm,
because we're used to one another's accents. Where if it's an English language accent that we're not used to, that might even be more conservative than either of ours, it was to be like, what the heck is this?
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
So I mean, I talked a bit about my own sort of journey into Latin, but where did it
Please
start
do.
for you? Was it
Oh,
school? Was it sort of university? When did you first get so interested in it? That's
I
a bit about your story.
Yeah, so when I was a kid, so my dad's an artist, Robert Ranieri, and he's his inspiration for his art comes primarily from ancient Roman architecture. So
Okay.
his parents were from Italy, and he had this. He speaks Italian. He was really
Mm,
wanted to learn as much as he could about those things. But he's not a linguist sort of person. He's an artist. But in any case,
mm,
he was just so inspired by that. And then I, as a little kid, oh, this is cool. I'm gonna learn Italian, learn about Latin someday.
mm,
And I didn't until I spent the first semesters abroad in Florence in Italy. And then I found the Familia Romana book, which
mm,
I'm familiar with. And I read that. I found like, oh, this is the key. This is what I needed. And then I learned Latin in a matter of 3 months, spending every single waking moment on that book.
mm,
I transcribed the thing because I was a little bit crazy about the reason I transcribed it. I'm trying to put myself down deliberately because it's not something that's for everybody. Boy, did it
mm.
work well for me because I
Yeah.
had the text, and I had the book open, and I had my computer, and I would read the line aloud, and I would hear it, and then I would type it because I wanted to try to input really
Mm,
good
mm.
input, really good Latin, from the basic to the more complex into my brain, and it worked. And it
Yeah.
also certainly probably worked that I knew some Italian at that point, and I was able to make some code switching, some what's the language transfer, like that great YouTube
Mm,
channel.
yeah. What was your attitude to grammar sort of when you were starting? Did you focus on it a lot? I mean, I guess the Orberg books, those who don't know, it's very it's just input basically, isn't it? Just very sort of increasing the comprehensibility, and the grammar sort of comes naturally is the philosophy. But
That's
what
the
was
right.
your sort of attitude to grammar?
Yeah, so that is the idea of comprehensible input, and the Familia Romana book, which is accompanied by a number of other books are French and English and Italian that were first made in the 1960s. But Orberg was the only author that continued refining it because
Yeah.
he realized this is a really good tool. And thank goodness he did, because he made such a good book. In fact, the reality is, even though it's input based and it's
Mm,
a graded reader, it is very traditional in how it presents
mm,
grammar, because one can learn a a language, even in a reading input method, that is much less traditional than that, where you're not presented any paradigms at all, or you're just expected to absorb them throughout. But he has these grammatica latina sections at every chapter, which tell you the thing you're supposed to learn grammatically. And with a couple exceptions, they're pretty much in the order of the way things are normally introduced. You don't learn too many verbs yet. You stay in the third
mm,
person, singular. The way he builds and constructs it is actually pretty traditional, even though it's to even today the regular traditional Latin professor, it seems so radical. But it
mm.
is, yeah, primarily input based. My own approach to grammar is I learned about the reason I found out about Familia Romana was I was wanting to learn Latin, so I was back in the Middle Ages of the internet in 2005,
Yeah.
and I found that this professor Dowling at Rutgers, he was taught, he said, this is the Dowling method. This is what I recommend to my students. And this article on his website, I don't think it's even there anymore. I made a video about it on Polymathy some years ago. And in fact, I recited the whole article because once the website disappeared, and then it came back, and now it's gone again. So I'm glad the whole text is at least recited in my
Yeah.
voice, because his advice was I thought was so good. It was good for me, and it has been good for a number of other people. And his advice is to memorize all the paradigms, and then to start Familia Romana. And
Mm,
that's the Dowling method, that you memorize all the verbs and nouns and adjectives, memorize all those paradigms. First, you understand basically what, nominative, genitive, dative is. You learn the basic cases. You learn the different conjugations, what they equate to in English. Like, okay, I hope I'll get this someday. And you will if you use
yeah.
Familia
Yeah.
Romana. That's the conjunction. You memorize the paradigms, then you read Familia Romana, and then you have reading fluency. And that's what I did. So that was my approach to grammar, in that I front loaded the paradigms, but I never stressed like the different kinds of, I don't know, names of the usages of the subjunctive or of the ablative of the I'm trying to think of one of the more obscure ones, ablative of respect or accusative of respect, or those kinds of things. I know them now,
Yeah.
but I didn't
Yeah.
need to learn those technical things first, since I, like you're describing, was learning through an input method, getting it
Mm, mm.
into my head, and then was able to reason out the logic of what was going on through the examples, rather than theory to practicality, and that tends to work pretty well learning wise.
Mm. And what sort of made you sort of take the leap from sort of reading it and sort of wanting to understand it to sort of speaking it and using it as a living language? And was that always there, or did that come later?
That was always there. That was the goal. I had no other
Yeah.
interest, really. I mean, reading was, oh, okay, Cicero, Virgil, yeah, I'm sure those are interesting, but I'm gonna speak it. That was what I really
Wow.
got
Yeah.
into. I was never, in fact, to when I was a kid, my mother's an avid reader, and
Mm.
I wasn't against reading as a kid, but I was not nearly as avid as a reader, say my sister or other people. And so I never that into reading books. Yeah, okay. I didn't do badly with any of the school classes. I like things like Shakespeare. I liked also Shakespeare was more spoken, more
Mm.
theatrical. I liked
Mm.
that too, but never was an avid reader. But when I learned Latin, I realized that in order to I mean, it was inevitable. Just reading Famiglia Romana, like, hey, I was introduced to these poems and literature, like, and then I didn't dislike poetry before I was interested, but that really made me like, whoa, poetry is amazing in Latin because of
Mm.
this
Mm.
phonemic vowel length, because of the syllable lengths, and they just create the most a truly unique poetry. I think it's better than ancient Greek poetry. Don't tell the Greeks that, or the ancient Greeks. They would all just be so mad.
Yeah.
Uh,
Controversial take.
but I really do think, as much as I really enjoy, the Iliad and the Odyssey and these and the Menander, I really like Menander, these ancient Greek poets. Latin just has, as a language, abilities that Greek doesn't. Um, which I'd love to get into if you want to
What,
talk
yeah,
about
what do you
the
think it
specifics.
has? Like, on top of Greek, do you
Oh,
think?
right, great. I mean, I love ancient Greek and I'm
Yeah.
constantly working with it. So this is not at all a diss to Greek, but Latin doesn't have pitch accent. It has a normal stress accent, something like English or Italian. And but however, it does not lengthen syllables that are stressed. So you
Mm.
can
Mm.
have something like ago, meaning I do, or I like this the related to the English word act. So ago, and that's the way it's normally pronounced in scholastically in school is
Yeah.
just like ago or something, right? Where they usually lengthen a little bit. Especially Italians will say ago. They'll lengthen that
Yeah.
first vowel in an open syllable, meaning only one consonant follows, quite a bit. And then they'll shorten the final one because this idea of saying habe, have, or tene,
Mm.
to meaning hold, tene, instead of tene. That's what an Italian would do. Tene. In Spanish would just say tene. They wouldn't this interesting thing is you have something stressed that's not long, but something that's unstressed that is long. Well, that's really cool. And that
Mm.
is a fundamental thing that, well, ancient Greek has that too, but has pitch accent. Now the structure though of a Latin line, just taking arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris, the first line of the Aeneid, that a lot of people know. So there we have in most hexameter, it's essentially a rule, especially post Lucretius, to make the first half more or less, the first few feet of the line, have the natural stress accent not be the beginning of the foot. The beginning of the foot is also
Okay.
um, where the ictus is a term that's been used and misused so much where people think it's actually a stress accent where it's not. Ictus is just the beginning of a beat. So I don't know. What's your favorite Beatles song?
What's my favorite Beatles song?
Or any that you could think of off the top of your head?
That's a tough one. It's got to be. Well, it's a bit controversial because I really like "With or Without You" by George Harrison and
Oh, that's a great one.
but it's not a very helpful one for this sake. Let's say "Yesterday."
Yesterday. Okay, let me see. Yesterday, and all my troubles seems so. Let's see. So all my troubles seem so far away. So this is
Mm.
the ictus, or what the ictus represents, which is the beat, the beginning of each syllable, the
Okay.
beginning of each metrical foot. Because a measure, just like in music, usually is divided up into in basically two beats, an on beat and an off beat. So
Hmm.
all my troubles seem so far away. So the that is that's the beat. Now that's also like the arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. Now, in the first half, we can hear that frequently one or two words will usually have the stress accent not on that beat.
Mm.
And if I do it somewhat just not, so if it's monotone, arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. Now, if I try to make each stress accent into a musical note, like a higher musical note, this is very
Yeah,
artificial, but it's just to get the point.
yeah, yeah.
So, arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris,
Mm.
primus aboris. At the end, they coincide, high pitch on the beat, on the
On the
ictus.
beat, yeah.
But in the first part, arma virumque cano. Actually, virumque should go up. Arma virumque cano Troiae. So cano and Troiae are definitely off. They're
Yeah.
not coinciding.
Mm.
This creates a kind of, to use a jazz term, it's syncopation,
Okay.
where it's not since they're not aligned, it creates a sense of being off balance, similarly like dancing. You're off balance
Mm.
and then back on balance. You're off balance, you're back on. That's why dancing is fun to do uh, in any kind of form, whether it's solo or with a partner. And it's that's a lot like Heraclitus talks about that the universe is this combination of tension and release like a bowstring, like the strings
Mm.
of a lyre. That's sort of the that's some artistic interpretation of the universe, but it feels that way in Latin poetry in a way that Greek poetry can't do because the pitch accent is not regarded at all as a structural element to the line, whereas most Latin poets do take that into consideration. And the few poems I've written in Latin, I know that if I write a hexameter line that doesn't do this, it
Mm.
feels weird. And then
Yeah.
I hope it ends, if it ends up not doing that, because Virgil's very famous for not doing that every
Mm.
single time, even though the example I gave did have some examples. Ovid he was a clock. He was always
Yeah.
no nego no bilium sedeo studiosus secorum. Like he's super regular, whereas Virgil was
Yeah.
much more jazzy in his irregularities from this thing that I just told you about. So that just doesn't exist in ancient Greek poetry. And that's what makes Latin poetry truly unique. And it probably, I don't know, definitely the best kind of poetry there is, even superior to ancient Greek poetry. That's
Oh,
how
it's
I feel.
actually good to hear that. Do you have like a favorite poet of ancient Rome? I mean, I know it's tough.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Or
Boy,
or a
that is
least
hard.
favorite maybe as well.
I don't know. Ovid's just got this place in my heart that I don't know, I really like all his
Yeah.
stuff. It's great. But um yeah, Ovid really resonated with him. Oh yeah, because he was also from I learned that I studied abroad in Italy
Mm.
in back in '05, and at that time, like I said, I was learned Latin on my own from Familia Romana. And then I was looking for my grandparents were from Abruzzo, which is a region in Italy, and it's if you know where Rome is, it's to the east towards the Adriatic Sea.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to I wanted to see where my grandparents were from. So I went there, and then I ended up having to spend the night in Sulmona because there was snow and a whole bunch of other things. So I didn't get to their hometowns yet. But then I was walking through Sulmona waiting for the train, and there's a statue of Ovid. Figured out
Mm.
just reading the inscription that Ovid was from Sulmona, Sulmo in Latin. That's where he was from. So he was actually from the same region as my grandparents, which is interesting because I had already developed the connection to his poetry stronger than I had with other poets. And I said, oh, but
Mm.
he's from Abruzzo. He's from Abrutium in Latin. He's from Abruzzo. And I thought that's cool. And I found that a bit inspiring. So he always has a place in my heart. Oh, and then I had to do a military, uh, I wouldn't even call it a mission or an expedition. I had to do a kind of a duty for the military in
Mm.
the army some years after that, some years ago in Romania. And I got to see the city of Constanța,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Constanța was it Tomis? I think that yeah, Tomis was the ancient name. That's where Ovid was exiled to and where he died. So there's a little museum to ancient Roman stuff and to him, and there's a statue of him. There's actually the statue I saw of him in Sulmona. The copy of it is there in front of that museum. So
Okay.
I have seen that statue twice,
Yeah.
um, in the two places. So I thought that wow, in his hometown and where he died, I found that very poetic.
Yeah,
So
very poetic.
yeah, but I could talk about any of the ancient Roman poets all day. They're all amazing.
Yeah, that's funny. You mentioned Constanza because just weirdly, I've not to sort of see Ovid, but I went there myself, and
Really?
then I realised this is where Ovid was exiled.
Yeah.
What did you make of Constanza? I mean, it's a fascinating place, isn't it? Because it's a real sort of meeting of sort of it felt very sort of Turkish, very sort of Eastern, but
Mm.
you know,
I I never been to Turkey, so I wouldn't couldn't say if it felt Turkish. It didn't definitely didn't feel quite like Italy. It felt different enough for me to notice it.
mm,
But I remember the casino on the cliff that was over the Black Sea. I remember that had an impact on me because it was I was expecting because I'd seen pictures of it. It's the famous, I think, image of like there's the Colosseum in Rome and the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and then there's that casino
yeah,
on the over the Black Sea on the cliff, and it's just not a museum. You can walk around it, but it's just collapsing, and you can't go in it. It's this old piece of history that's not being taken care of, and it's interesting. The difference of course, there was, especially under the Soviet influence, incredible poverty in Eastern Europe, which evidently these countries are still trying to recover from because I would have expected a the thing that's on all the postcards to be at least
mm.
taken care of, but we can't, I
It's
guess.
very sad. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
and
so much.
once these things aren't, they're not about forever. You know, it's not that you can go back and you know, look after them, you know, repair them. You know, um, it's there's something sort of. I mean, I guess it's what makes the classical world so fascinating. It's
Mm.
like you know, once it's gone, it's gone. You know, so you have to be
Mm. Oh
very careful
yeah,
with it.
yeah. Even recent places in was it Aleppo that was destroyed? And there's a place in
I think so.
Afghanistan in the
Yeah.
late 90s and that of
Mm.
great enormous Buddhist statues, those kinds of things. Just like,
Yeah. Yeah.
because well, and I suppose that's because I feel so much of what we are is at least the received sense of history. So
Mm.
if we take that from ourselves, it's just such a tragedy.
I know.
Yeah. Well, what about
Um,
your Latin journey?
yeah. So I studied it in school. So I think year eight, which I don't know what that is in for you Americans, but like start of secondary school,
Uh-huh.
basically. And yeah, they were very big on like a bit of classical education at my school. So
Mm.
they taught everyone Latin. Of course, many people sort of just didn't really enjoy it, you know.
Mm.
Um, and so people would slowly drop off. But I rather enjoyed it. I just sort of kept doing it, and it got to I was in sort of my last 2 years of school. I sort of got really fascinated by it. I remember we were doing Pro Malone, yeah, the Cicero speech,
Right.
and I just got fascinated by it all of a sudden, and um, then I went on to study it at university, and that's where I really started my this sort of journey of like just curious. Because the thing I was really curious about was kind of what it would sound like, you know.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
you know, I like the grammar of Latin. It's really fascinating. But what really excited me was you could just pick up a book and you just read it and you'd understand. You wouldn't have to underline anything and
Yeah.
translate it and look it up.
Yeah.
That's what really sort of got me going with it. That was really exciting, and you know, I really enjoyed studying it at school and university. But I always felt like that sort of one question I was seeking with Latin. I never quite sort of got. I feel like a lot of it was um, just too much grammar, you know. And it's great you can study it for its own sake, um, but I always had this
Is it?
curiosity slightly beyond it.
I mean, I've always been fond of grammar in my studies of the languages, but its ability to have a person acquire language is quite limited, and that's
Yeah,
the issue
yeah.
that is we who enjoy or believe that the input method is the better way to learn try to advocate.
Mhm, mhm. And so you're quite an accomplished linguist in many other areas. So you do
Oh, I wouldn't say that, but
well.
definitely a dilettante and proud to be one.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you do ancient Greek and Latin. You mentioned Italian. Am I right in
Hmm.
thinking you speak a bit of Japanese as well?
Ah, yes, I dare say I did. I spoke it
Yeah,
quite comfortably and fluently when I
yeah.
was living there. I was in the Air Force. I was stationed in Tokyo, and so yeah, I tried. That was a lot of fun, and it would be so enjoyable to get back into it. But after I left Japan, I went into flight school, and that
Mm,
took up, so that was another more than 2 years of time and required intense study. There was no room for Japanese, really, and I didn't really think I would lose it so entirely, but then that I did, in the sense that
mm,
mostly I noticed it just because I've even seen maybe a few things that I wrote in notes in Japanese, and I can't
yeah,
read them anymore. I'm sure I could. I'm sure I could
yeah.
restudy it, and it would be much faster for me to relearn the language than it was to learn it the first time. Much, much faster. I'm sure it wouldn't take that long at all. But other than the basic more the syllabaries, the syllabic writing systems, which are easier to remember. So many of the kanji, the Chinese characters that are used in Japanese, there are about 2,000 that you have to memorize. And I knew them
Mm,
all. I could write them
mm,
all from memory, and I knew all their meanings.
yeah.
I only a fraction of those have stuck around. But this is actually, it's funny. That's also true of the Japanese, and I constantly work with them. They can't remember, like, hey, how do you write that one? And they do this. And they're like, oh wait, then I have to write it down. Oh, okay. That's for some of the ones that they don't use nearly as often.
Mm,
Or but they probably could read it and remember if they recognize it. But I've lost a lot of that ability. That would be fun
yeah.
to do again. Just don't have any reason. And I have
Mm, mm, mm.
I don't know. I feel like I mean I appreciate the fact that I now have an obligation to my audience to make stuff that's related to Latin and Greek. So I should probably do that in Coptic now. Now I brought in Coptic
Yeah,
and
yeah. Oh, really? Wow. Cool. That's something
yeah,
I
slowly.
know nothing about. But
Coptic's
yeah.
fun. We can talk about Coptic a little bit too if you
Yeah,
want. It's super
let's,
interesting.
yeah.
All right, cool. So Coptic, I got inspired to study it because Coptic is the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, or maybe we should just call it Egyptian, because we can call it ancient. Modern Egyptian is just a dialect of Arabic,
Yeah.
if you like. But the Egyptian or ancient Egyptian language, its final stage is just known as Coptic. Copt itself is Copt or Gopt, and that
Mm.
is from the Arabic interpretation of the word Aegyptos, Egypt or Egyptian. So they heard
Really?
Aegyptos and they turned into Gopt, Copt. So we call it Copt in English, Coptic, but it just means Egyptian. And in Coptic, the word for the Coptic language is Metrem, which just means the speech of the people of Egypt, literally. So it just means Egyptian
Wow.
language.
Okay.
So there wouldn't be a different name for like classical Egyptian or something in the most basic term. Kind of like how we say Greek between modern Greek or ancient Greek, you have to put a
Mm,
qualifier in front of it. So Coptic is just Egyptian. It's the last stage of ancient Egyptian before it died. It died somewhere
mm,
in the Renaissance, European Renaissance, more or less between the 16th and 18th centuries, if I recall, the last native speakers passed away. But it remains the liturgical language of the Coptic Church, which is interesting.
mm,
So,
mm.
the pronunciation is something. It's a spelling pronunciation that's so, so the Coptic comes around as a written form of vernacular Egyptian in about the third century AD, second, third century AD.
Mm.
And it's written in the Greek alphabet with a few characters taken from hieroglyphics where was no equivalent sound. For example, fa, though that's a part
Mm.
of the modern Greek pronunciation, the Greek that was spoken in Egypt didn't have fa, although it did exist over in Italy, but we'll talk about that later if you're
Mm.
interested. So there was no fa and there's no cha, like in modern Greek, in
Yeah.
the ancient Greek pronunciation system in the area of Egypt. Thus, the Egyptians, wanting to use the Greek alphabet to write their language, had to import fa and cha from Demotic, which was a later the stage prior to Coptic, and Demotic
Mm.
written in Demotic and hieratic and hieroglyphics, and so all these forms of writing the Egyptian language. So anyway, they imported those in, but otherwise most of the letters look like Greek. Thus,
Mm.
in the 1800s, there was a I'm trying to remember the name of this reformer, basically an attempt to reunify the Coptic Church with the Greek Orthodox Church, and the result was then to create the Greco-Bohairic pronunciation. Bohairic is the liturgical dialect, and there's about seven
Okay.
dialects of Coptic,
Of
but
Coptic.
Bohairic is the liturgical dialect of it. And so the Greco-Bohairic pronunciation is basically just pronouncing the Bohairic Coptic
Mm.
text, which every letter, though, that looks like a Greek letter, you pronounce it the Greek way. Well, that leads to problems because the notion was, well, clearly the Egyptian, the way of pronouncing things has been corrupted. So let's get back to the original Greek pronunciation of the letters. But they
Mm.
just assumed that the modern Greek pronunciation was the same as the ancient Greek pronunciation. The same mistake that most Greeks repeat today because for some reason, their schooling seems to insist that ancient Greek is pronounced exactly like modern Greek. I even have a fascinating book that was written by a a Greek professor
Yeah.
who teaches Greek, very enthusiastic about teaching ancient Greek, but insists and tries and uses every single proof for how we know that ancient Greek is actually pronounced differently to say the opposite, and it requires the most insane kinds of contorted logic. Like you
Yeah.
have to, and he's called himself a linguist. It's like, no, you can't be a linguist because you don't understand the first thing about it. So it's just really like, what? Anyway, excuse me for complaining. These are the things that run through my head. But so Coptic is really cool. It's
Mm.
what it is like. I don't know it terribly well, but it is way more like Arabic or Hebrew. It's an
Mm.
Af Egyptian. All the forms of it are Afro-Asiatic, and so are the Semitic languages. They're also
Okay.
Afro-Asiatic and part of that group. So there are words that are super similar, even like ani, ana. Those are in I think in Arabic and Hebrew, meaning
Yeah,
I,
I
the
think
pronoun
so.
I,
Yeah.
and it's anoch. So it's anok in Coptic. So you see so many different things look just like their equivalent pronouns and things. In
Mm.
like there's a sound of fa that's used for he in the present tense, both in Arabic and Coptic, if I recall, in different stages of Egyptian. So that's not because of some kind of that's because they have a common origin, and
Yeah.
that's super cool. But I barely know the Semitic languages either. So
That's fascinating. Semitic languages are
yeah.
just real, just so different from anything I've ever seen before. I mean, I'd
They're
love to study
they're
this
diff
any at some
I
point.
swear there's yeah, sorry I interrupted you. The except for the vowel switches in the middle of the words, you have the three um consonants essentially, or three major pieces of most Semitic words. There's something similar that's in older forms of Egyptian. Coptic doesn't have that really anymore. It has a few of those umlautings, if you will, those changing of
Mm.
internal vowels like goose to geese, that kind of thing, mouse to mice. It has a couple, but very, very, very few are remaining in Coptic. And otherwise, it's just, I don't know. If it weren't so foreign, it would be way easier than Latin or Greek.
Interesting.
Way
Interesting.
easier. Because you don't have to there's very, very little respect to conjugating things. There's nothing like declensions.
No, really.
It's far simpler. Yeah. It's
Wow.
it's it's very, very it's quite analytical,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to the synthetic languages like Latin and Greek.
And is it still? It's funny we're talking about this actually because I actually walked past I'm in London at the moment. I just walked past a sort of Egyptian Coptic church the other day, and it had some
Really?
Coptic written on it. So it's so funny that we're talking about it now.
Oh, it's so cool.
Um,
Yeah.
but is it? I mean, I'm assuming it's still used as a liturgical language, much like Latin is in the Vatican and in Catholic Church. So it still
hmm
kind of lives on in that sense, I guess.
Yeah, and there's been some interest in revival. There's some attempts to reconstruct the pronunciation before the Greco-Bohairic pronunciation came into effect in the mid 1800s. So
Mm.
there are a number of, I understand a number of Christian Egyptians, Copts, as they often call themselves,
Yeah.
who are interested in this and the and using it as a somewhat of you know, not to the same extent as Latin or even ancient Greek for that matter yet, but there is some interest there. And I find it fascinating because it's the only gateway I know to get to something that may arguably be more interesting, which is older forms of Egyptian,
Mm.
even late Egyptian, say nothing of Middle Egyptian, which is classical Egyptian, to be able to read hieroglyphics. But there's a problem, is that none of the textbooks of ancient Egyptian teach you the vowel sounds, even though they can be reconstructed now. So how do you reconstruct them? Now, my colleague and dear friend Stefano Vittori is the foremost expert, I think, in the world of the Egyptian language, and he basically said, well, you need to learn Coptic
Mm.
in order to be able to reconstruct the vowels because he can do it spontaneously because he's also a genius, which is helpful and
Yeah.
not so he's but you're able to do that if you know Coptic first. So once you know Coptic, then you can see it's so cool too Egyptian because it's this 2,000 year written history of language change. Wait, longer.
Mm.
Is it longer than that? 2,000? It's at least 2,000 years. This hugely long period, 2,500, I think. The old, you might have heard the old thing like Cleopatra is closer to us than she was to when
Yeah.
the pyramid
Yeah.
builders lived. This incredibly
Crazy.
long
Yeah.
history of the language. So you get to see the changes, and then it's not too difficult to reconstruct the sound changes, and thus also the vowels, how they were, because ancient Egyptian, much like Semitic languages, writes primarily consonants and the matres lectionis, if you've heard of that, which are the mothers of the reading. Mater
Okay.
lectionis, the mother of the reading. That is a term. I don't know why it's in Latin, but it's refers to Semitic languages primarily, and also Egyptian, because there are basically letters that are vowel-like, but maybe more consonant-like. For example, the sound for a y,
Mm.
the sound for y is used to represent a long e sound. So in
Okay.
Hebrew and Arabic have an equivalent letter for that y sound, and then when you see it, depending on where it is in the word, and once you learn the language, you know that, oh, that means e. And there's also similar ones for w. It would be, oh, that's supposed to be oo, but in other
Okay.
places it would
Yeah.
be the consonant y or w. And so those are examples of matres lectionis.
Okay.
Yeah,
One thing I wanted to ask you quickly, of course, it's time, so we'll wrap up soon. But one thing I
sure.
wanted to ask you was obviously you spend a lot of time studying like these ancient languages. What do you think you prefer, like ancient or modern? Which
That's
uh
interesting.
what do you prefer studying?
Well, now it's Latin and Greek. I'm in too deep. The
Mm.
sunk cost fallacy is strong
Yeah,
with this
yeah,
one. So
yeah.
anyway, the, it's inevitable. Yeah, but it's mostly maybe it's because, well, obviously it's become my part of my important part of my career, and I have something to contribute, which is
Mm.
pretty much what I discovered. I think because I studied German and then Italian, all the Romance languages. There was a little bit Latin and a little bit of ancient Greek in the background there, but I'd studied a lot of modern languages, and most classicists don't get around to doing that very
Mm.
frequently. They don't
Mm.
necessarily get fluent. They don't work on phonology or pronunciation very much. Even the people that wrote about phonology, famous ones like the Sidney Allen, who wrote Vox Latina and Vox Graeca. Are you familiar with those?
Vaguely, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, they're
I don't know
good.
much
Oh, they're
about
all.
it.
You should definitely get Vox Latina, especially because I don't agree with him on everything. That's sort of the point I
Yeah.
wanted to make. I've somewhat famously disagreed on some. I don't. For me, they're kind of a big deal, but they're really not that big a deal with the construction of Latin pronunciation. If someone uses Sidney Allen's system, they'll sound fine.
Mm.
Um, and but there's some details that I believe he got wrong in his interpretation of both ancient languages simply due to lack of experience. For example, with ancient Greek, he said, I remember because he wrote in the 70s, the Vox Graeca, reconstruction of classical Attic pronunciation. Ancient Greek has pitch accent. So
Mm.
the problem, though, is then if you're going to reconstruct classical Greek, you have to use pitch accent, right? Well, he said that, well, I've heard so many tapes of people from around the world trying it, and they all sucked. This is paraphrasing.
Yeah,
This old Cambridge professor, they all
yeah.
sucked,
That's
man.
what he wrote.
They're all terrible. Um, and he said therefore his recommendation is not to use pitch accent.
Mm.
I learned Japanese fluently, as you generously introduced earlier in this video, generous to this point that I want to make now. I've learned a
Mm.
pitch accent language, a language which does not have stress accent. Ancient
Yeah.
Greek might have had some stress accent as a secondary component. When I recite Ancient Greek, I usually include stress accent where the pitch accent is, because people can't hear pitch accent. For example, famous a couple of the famous cities that tragically were obviously bombed in World War II, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So,
Mm.
like, do you say Hiroshima or Hiroshima? I'm asking, it's not
What
rhetorical.
do
Which
I
one do
say? I would say
which comes more naturally to you? If you had to discuss the first atomic bomb was detonated at, well, detonated in wartime.
I would say Hiroshima.
Hiroshima, and both are
Yeah,
used in
yeah.
Hiroshima and Hiroshima. Well, which is right? Neither. Of course, we have the vowel difference that we say Hiroshima if it's stressed and Hiroshima with a I if it's not
Mm.
stressed, so I and which is just, that's how English prefers it. Or Hiroshima, maybe someone would do I Hiroshima. But where does the stress go? There is no stress in Japanese. It does not exist as a concept. There is pitch
Yeah.
accent, though. The problem is pitch accent doesn't map onto English. So the issue then is being able to, how do you pronounce any name? I had a colleague, his name was Kumagaya. But do you
Mm.
say Kumagaya in English? Do you say Kumagaya? Gaya? Kumagaya? Like, what do you do? All of them are essentially, they're all approximations. All of them are wrong in that sense, because without pitch accent it doesn't work. Thus,
Mm. Mm.
there's no, it's not like pitch accent is something that doesn't exist. It's also, but that's the point I'm getting to, is having experienced modern Italian, modern Greek, of course, as well as Japanese. Those three really have been important in my understanding of Latin and Greek phonology. The pitch accent, and Japanese also has phonemic vowel length and double consonants and long and short
Mm.
syllables and vowels and all the stuff that's fundamental to, it's actually more similar to ancient Greek even than it is to Latin, but it's also similar to
Mm.
Latin since it has, without pitch accent, it has those other things in common. It's moraic. It's based on the mora is the fundamental unit as opposed to the syllable and say modern Greek or Italian. So those I would say that because I had that experience, and then I was able to begin applying them to my understanding of Latin ancient Greek, and I felt like I had some things to share with people. Like, hey, we don't need to sound like. In fact, I saw some YouTuber doing a little thing where she doesn't do Latin or Greek stuff, but she was playing a character like ego sum. She was
Yeah.
British too. So it was like ego sum. What did you say? Ego sum domina magistra. Something or other like this, and she had memorized all the lines. The Latin text, whatever she had
Mm.
memorized, she might have even written it herself, was fine, but it was absolutely terrible as far as that pronunciation goes. Well, terrible in the sense that that's not a loyal reconstruction of the pronunciation. It was so
Mm.
far off. So as politely, I try to be more polite now than I once was. Politely as I can, I feel like I can say, well, you can do it that way, and that's fine. If you're happy with that, I am not gonna harsh your groove there. You just go right ahead.
Mm.
Ego sum magistra, go right ahead. But why not do, ego sum magistra, and just say ego sum magistra harum linguarum, and I don't sound like Italian or Spaniard or something, but I still feel like that, leaning towards that,
Mm.
leaning
Mm.
towards trying to reduce features that are definitively of my native English accent,
Mm.
um, and definitely not a part of Latin, and try to incorporate where possible things that are more Spanish or Italian-y sounding. I think that's a good thing. That's the way
Mm.
I see it, and that's why I like to still continuing to, I suppose, prefer. I've definitely been preferring these ancient languages because they there's so many people who do the modern languages and they do them so well, and a lot of people do the ancient languages really well. I mean, I'm just a
Yeah.
voice in the chorus anywhere, but I really enjoy the what I've been able to contribute to the
Mm.
conversation, shall we say.
Well, on that note, I just think before I leave, because I know you got to rush off, I thought it'd be fun to just try and speak a bit of Latin with you, if I could have the honor. I'm
Certe et mi honori est, amice.
oh, gracias, Tiago. Quid I'll sort of really make sure my accent's really good now. Quid faciebis hodie post hoc podcast.
Hodie sorore meam inuisam equidem cum canibus sororis iter facturus sum quia equidem unam cum amassia mea nos oppido amamus canes et ego velim iter facere foris cum canibus suroris et sunt tam amabilis est Dazzle et Daisy et Theo et sunt canes pulcherrimi
Ah, sick.
yeah.
Um, it's too in Urbe Vaticana. She said, conloquendum cum sacerdote catholico faciebas quomodo erat conloquere in
Mm.
Latina in radio.
In Radio Vaticana
Sì, sì,
valde pulcre fuit. Equidem invitatus eram ut colloquerer cum alis presentatoribus de hiscerebus id quod sunt homines qui locuntur Latine. Atque
sì,
ille Monsignor, non hi venit vocabulum Latinum ad Monsignor
Monsignor.
digendum, sed ille sacerdos, summus sacerdos, digamus, ille tam avertus fuit et tam pulcre loquebatur, tam
Mm,
profluenter loquebatur et sermo cinabatur, et
sì.
iucundum fuit.
It's in hoc conloquendo habebis vocem ecclesiastica
Certissime abui.
Italica.
Certe, et gratias tibiago quod hoc vidisti et notasti, propterea quod quago qualis hominibus ecclesiastice pronunciantibus colloquor velin eo pronunciatu loqui quia facilius est illis me intellegere, equidem si esset
Mm,
Anglice difficile loqui meo accentu hoc est sonus vocis. Tecum vellem etiam Britannico pronunciatu uti, sed non
yeah,
necesset quia Britanni per bene Americanos intellegunt. Sed in lingua latina qui etiam mi placet uti
sì,
et ecclesiastica pronunciatione nec non classica pronunciatione ambabus
ita,
laetor
ita.
quotius.
Et quid est quae sunt tua uh, futura linguae latinae? Quid est?
Mm. Oh.
Uh, is it tua in tua
Mhm.
sententia?
Id est totius linguae
In
futurae totius linguae latinae rogas.
yeah,
Equidem credo propteria quod habemus rete, hoc est internet, rete habemus,
ita.
et rete omnium gentium de internet, the World
Mhm.
Wide Web habemus, et propter hoc nos possumus discere docere multo facilius quondam docebamus. Hodie,
Ita.
qui libet homo potest legere aliquid videre pelliculam, videre aliquem latine eloquentem aut legente, docente, et sibi dicere, et ego velim latine, dicere, quamodit
Ita.
facere possim? Ille dicit familia
Mm.
romanam, bonum libro esse, forse fortasse ad
Ita.
Amazona, eo ut Emma, e un libro,
Mm.
et sic et ego possim latine discere,
Ita.
et sic mm, passim, non magno numero, non enormi eh, multitudine, eh, sed passim erunt semper homines ut nos, qui linguae latinae favemus, et qui volent discere et docere. Eh,
Ita.
Hoc est futurum pulcrum.
Ita est res mira.
Mm.
Rete, you say, for internet.
Est res mira est.
Et
Est.
possumus linguae antiquae et parvae um, uh, sunt multae opportunitates in
Mhm.
futura quae prima non non erant pulchra futura ut
Est
dicam.
verum. Est verum. Licete mihi addere aliquid Anglicae ad spectatores dicendum, velim
Um,
Anglicae aliquid dicere spectatoribus tuis,
uh,
auscultatoribus tuis.
say something in English to
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, I
please.
want to add just something in English, because it's one of the reasons, like why who cares about Latin? Reason I think Latin and other ancient languages are of such value,
Mm,
and why
mm,
I also find them so enriching is because they connect us to the past in a way that's just not possible. With
mm,
English, for
mm.
example, we could barely get into Shakespeare without feeling like, wow, this is weird. As much as we might
Yeah.
love it, I certainly do, but it's quite foreign to us. Whereas the Latin that we learn in school is the same Latin that Cicero spoke, more or
Mm,
less. It's virtually the same dialect, because there's only one dialect of Latin, except for the Latin Vulgate Bible, which no one, like even the ecclesiastical church in Latin, that for centuries, along with the Renaissance, the church, just like every other scholar, has
mm.
gone for pretty much a full classical dialect model of Latin. So there's
Yeah.
really only one Latin that anybody has consistently written in, which is very different than English. Thus, if we learn Latin, then we can read pretty much 2,000 years of history. If not, we're dependent on translations and
Mm,
translators.
mm, mm.
So that's powerful.
It is powerful. It's amazing. Um, there's some part of me that doesn't quite believe it, that like if I read, I mean, you mentioned Cicero, like um, if I that he wrote that and that was his language and he understood that, and but
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah. I mean, there are
Um,
some filters, right? Because we have very few ancient manuscripts, if any,
yeah, true,
that are
true.
from that time period. But we do have like some of the first early codices, the early books,
Mm,
but they were already transcribed from originals that were lost.
mm,
So we just have to trust that they were loyally transcribed. But often we find inscriptions or quotes or these other things that quote
yeah.
the book or the thing, and then we say that it's identical, so we can at least have the confidence that this isn't some literature that was invented 500 years later. This is
Mm,
really it. It is loyally transcribed, but it's still there's an element of well, I mean, faith, this faith in the process that led to those conclusions, in the same way that we understand that, yeah, I can't see any subatomic particles, but I know they're there in anything I look at. I just
yeah.
have to understand that because I've done other scientific things in my life, as many people have done like something. So that's why we take science class, to realize this is how you learn. Like, hey, look, this balloon and hydrogen, it explodes, and then like, oh, well, why does that happen? Begin to understand the chemistry, and then you develop this intuitive. Uh, it's interesting. I wouldn't normally use the term belief or
Mm,
faith in in these kinds of discussions, but you have enough. This is a very, very different from the normal way of using it too. I mean, the sense that you trust that, yeah, this is not some invented piece of history. This is real history, and we have all the archaeological evidence to corroborate it. But I didn't go out and study all those manuscripts to
Mm,
prove it. So,
mm.
but which is the point of that is not to say that we should be skeptical that they're real. Of course, they're real, but
Yeah.
that that they are that goodness they were preserved as well as they were.
Yes. Thank goodness. Yeah. Well, Luke, it's
Yeah.
been a real pleasure. It's been really fun. I'm really glad we got this organized. Just before you go,
Thanks for having me, Alfie. I really
oh,
appreciate it.
not at all, not at all. What's next for you? What are your sort of plans for the YouTube channel? And I mean, you've got lots of other things on the go. So,
Oh my gosh, so many things. So I have a couple things coming up for the Legionarius series
mm.
with the German time traveler, since they're now in
Oh
the
yeah,
present in New York City. One of those things is filmed. Another one needs to be filmed. That's something that when I started 3 years ago, I imagined it would have been a lot easier to make
yeah,
them, but it's just logistically so difficult with the armor. My fiance is wonderful because she films me now, and so it makes it a lot easier to try to make anything happen. But it still presents a number of logistical difficulties. Just getting the armor to New York City and then putting it on.
yeah. There
Although I
must
did
be a
enjoy
lot
walking around in
involved.
it, and that's the next thing. That'll be the next one that comes out. I talk at people in Latin and in an invented ancient Roman accent in English. It's pretty entertaining.
Wow, I look forward to
I
seeing
think it
it.
is. Yeah, so that's that one in Plymouth. More geology stuff. It's always ancient Greek stuff. So I have a lot of things to be doing on ancient Greek phonology and Latin and things like that. Those are always coming every month. But now, at least every month, a geology series that we recorded out west, explaining the geological history and formations of some of the coolest places out west in the U.S., like the Grand Canyon
Mm.
and the Sierra Nevada mountains and the Arches National Park in Utah, and some really cool stuff. I can't wait to edit those because it's just beautiful out there.
Wow, brilliant. Well, Luke, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Rest
Alfie.
of your day.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Vale.
Vale.